I've been responsible for the issue of Brexit in the Scottish Government since August 2016, just about a couple of months after the referendum when Nicola asked me to take this job on. And as many of you know, I was asked to do three things, the first of which was to negotiate on behalf of Scotland with the UK government and with others, but formally with the UK government about what Scotland needed to get out of the process we're engaged in, particularly as we hadn't voted for it. Secondly, to work on what the optimum solution for Scotland was, short of remaining in the EU, although that is the optimum solution without a doubt, but to work on that and to come up with ideas on it. And thirdly, to do things like this, to talk to people, to listen to people, to hear people's point of view, and to fold that into the work that I was doing. And I've been doing that job now for almost 2 years. In the end of June, the job has changed a little, and I took over responsibility for government business as well in terms of the government's legislative programme, largely because, as I'll indicate in a minute, the pressure on the government's legislative programme in Scotland, as in England, will be Brexit related for the foreseeable future. But I've been doing that job for 2 years, and essentially I now find myself in a position where I think it is impossible to predict what will happen next. I mean, and I find myself in good company in that. There are a few really distinguished commentators on Brexit who write and who tweet and who broadcast on it. And a couple in particular I admire: Charles Grant, the head of the European Research Centre, based in London, who is a member of the First Minister's Standing Council on Europe, which is the body that advises the Scottish Government. And David Alan Grant, who is a lawyer, a commentator, and writes for the Financial Times. And in the last 2 weeks, both of them have said publicly they don't know what's going to happen. So I'm in really good company in that. And I was talking with a journalist last week, very well connected to the Tory party. Somebody who you would think, if anybody knew what was going to take place, he would know. And he said he had no idea what was going to happen over the next few months. So I say that not to upset people, although I managed to upset people quite easily in Scotland on this issue, but simply to say that we are in completely uncharted waters. We can look back at what's happened and see that there was a narrow victory in these islands for those people who wanted to leave on the 23rd of June 2016, but a very substantial majority in Scotland, as in Northern Ireland, as in London, against leaving. We can look at the opinion polls and see since that time support for Brexit itself has gradually been eroded. We can look at the latest YouGov opinion poll looking at this issue in great detail 2 weeks ago with a very large sample that essentially told us that where we are now is that Brexit as a project is supported in the majority only in the south of England and in middle England. It is opposed in the north of England, in London, Northern Ireland, and also in Wales. We can look at the political support for Brexit, where that same poll showed that it is now only in a majority in the Conservative Party in terms of voters who support Brexit. All the other parties have a majority against, apart from UKIP, of course. And we can look at the demographics of it and see that there is still a majority support for Brexit for those who are roughly over 55, but below that, the support, and the younger the voter is, the more massive, the support against leaving the EU. So we've got a very strange situation. There is, although there was a mandate on the UK level for what is taking place, there is no longer a mandate. And whatever that mandate was for, it was not explicitly for the hardest and most damaging form of Brexit, which is what we appear to be heading towards. So in a logical political system, you would think that somebody was saying, hold on, this has changed, things have changed, let's just slow down and work out what we actually want to do now. But in fact, the situation has deteriorated pretty substantially in the last 2 to 3 months, and now the trajectory is towards that hard, very damaging Brexit, which could be a no-deal outcome. Doesn't have to be, but could be a no-deal outcome. And when the history of this is written, Anton Muscatelli, the principal of Glasgow University, said at a dinner recently that I was at that this would be a fascinating thing to write, as long as it wasn't happening to your own country. And he's pretty right about that. But when the history of this thing is written, it will take an awful lot to understand how that position could have been come to. And it's not just a Tory party that's desperate not to fall apart and desperate to stay in government, but it's also a Labour Party that has not taken the opposition ground that people thought it would take. So where are we today and what might happen? And as I've said, I don't know, but I'm going to give you a couple of guesses where I think this trajectory is going and what it will mean for Argyll and Bute. I think that 3 months ago, I would have said the prospect of the UK leaving the EU without a formal withdrawal deal in place were very small indeed. I would have said that that was the province of extremists who might have wanted that to happen, but it would be so damaging that nobody rationally would allow it to happen. I now believe the chances of it happening are, difficult to tell, 40 to 50%, probably as high as that at the present moment. And that is not because the lunatics have taken over, though some of them have. It is because it may not be possible to get a deal. A no deal may be simply something that happens. Now, a no deal is not this nicely ordered thing that people talk about, World Trade Organization terms and regulation of trade, because being a member of the EU is about a lot more than trade. It's about a whole set of interlinked and intermeshed activities, which include trading standards, regulations, aviation, nuclear safety. There's a whole range of ways in which we are enmeshed within the European system. And unless there is an orderly withdrawal from them, they simply stop. If there was no arrangement in place for a transition period, whilst all those things were negotiated, and that's what the UK government has been trying to secure, departure on the 29th of March, 2 years after implementing delivering the Article 50 letter, but now, something the Prime Minister said she didn't want. David Davis told me, first time I had a conversation with him, there would be no transition period, because it just encouraged civil servants to believe that we weren't leaving. But now what the UK government wants is a implementation period, a transition period that would last from the 29th of March next year until the end of 2020. But it would mean no transition period. It would simply mean that all the arrangements, all these vast range of arrangements simply stop. And in some areas, it's impossible to see how that could work. Aviation is one. Aviation isn't just about, the aviation agreement isn't just about routes, it's about the training of pilots, it's a recognition of qualifications, it's about maintenance, it's about all those things. If that doesn't exist, then there would be no trust in what was happening in the UK, because there could be no check on what was happening in the UK, and therefore there would be a default position that says, hang on a minute, you can't operate your aircraft in our airspace until we are assured that all these things are still in place. No matter what the UK says, and this is what we'll see in the documents that are going to be published later this week, the documents about a no deal, it's not enough to say we're already observing the standards. They have to be able to be checked. I heard the Taoiseach, the Irish Prime Minister, say something very, very profound about this at the British-Irish Council in Guernsey in June, where he said trust comes not from good faith, not from somebody saying, I'm doing this. Trust comes from a legal framework, which means you can check whether they're doing it. You trust people in the European relationship because you know you can enforce the regulation. There is a legal underpinning relationship. And that means that people do observe it because they know they can be caught out and taken to court if they don't observe it. So when we see these documents on Thursday, and I've seen quite a number of them already, these documents say we'll just go on doing what we're doing now. But that's not enough. You can't just say we're going to go on doing things. There has to be a means to check that they're being done. And if you don't accept the authority of the European Court of Justice, there is no means. So it is possible that on the 29th of March, there will be no deal. And that will mean a dislocation of the present way in which we live our lives. Now, it's not going to be the end of the world. The sun will still rise in the morning. There will still be plenty of opportunities to do things, but it's not going to be business as usual. And anybody who tells you it's going to be business as usual either doesn't know what they're talking about or isn't telling the truth. Now, presently, I noticed there was a piece last week from one of the right-wing journalists that said what would happen would be a no-deal deal. And a no-deal deal means that you agree on the things that have to continue, but you say, we can't agree on anything else, we'll have to go on talking. And that's a possibility. But it does look as if we're hurtling towards that, and it might have been a desire 3 months ago by the UK to frighten some people who wanted a no deal so they would talk it up, but we are now in a position where that's a possibility. The man called Roberto Gualtieri, who is the chair of the European Parliament's Finance Committee, I saw him about 6 weeks ago, said that his great fear of a no deal was not that people would actually actively want it. They could blunder into it, but because it might become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If financial institutions begin to think it's going to be a no deal, then maybe that's what's going to happen. It's a bit like the old story of mobilization in the First World War. Maybe if that starts, you can't really stop that. So that's a possibility, and we've got to be aware of that. And the Scottish Government has started a process of trying to put in place everything we can to protect as much as we can in those circumstances. And that's in parallel with the UK government. I mean, we disagree with Brexit. We've made that absolutely clear. This is a ridiculous thing that's happening in our view. But on an issue like this, of course, we will work with the UK government to try and protect people. And that's what we're doing. We can't, not everything can be protected. There's been a lot of talk about stockpiling medicines. Well, there's some medicines you can't stockpile. They have a limited shelf life. There's some regulation and law we just don't have time to do. But what we can do, we will do. There are some things which we can't do anything about. If there is a tariff barrier erected, some sort of difficulty with trading that holds up traffic on the M20 on the way to Dover. I'm going to Dover next week to see the arrangements in the port, but if there is that, then shellfish from Tarbert will not make it to Paris in time to be edible. That's simply that. There's nothing we can do about that. If there is that type of blockage, that type of business can't continue to do what it's doing. Maybe it can sell them to somebody else. Maybe they can find another market, but there'll just be some things in a no deal that cannot be dealt with. But we'll do our very best to protect as much as we can in those circumstances. Now that may not happen, because there's still the prospect that there could be a deal on the terms that the Prime Minister has announced at Chequers and which formed the basis of the White Paper. And that's a possibility, although there are things in it that the EU can't sign up to. But maybe over a period of time those can change. And indeed, that's, the EU itself has not rejected those proposals out of hand. It has indicated what it doesn't think will work, but it's prepared to negotiate. The real difficulty that the Prime Minister has is she may not be able to command a majority in her own party for those proposals. There are 100 Tory MPs who won't support them. And she's sort of, as a colleague of mine put it the other day, she's sort of Chequers mated. It wasn't a great joke, but it's not a bad one. If she moves to satisfy the EU, she will lose more of her own party. If she moves to satisfy her own party, she won't satisfy the EU. And that's a difficult, that's one which we as a government, talking to the UK government, are saying, look, you have to move in this in order to get a deal. The UK government believes we should be pleased with the White Paper and Chequers because it's moved towards our position. And it has moved towards recognising the importance of the single market and the customs union, which I spoke about at length here last time and which is still very, very important. But it hasn't moved far enough to protect the integrity of the single market, and that's really important to the EU. And it's not fanciful. It's treated by some people like Dominic Raab and others treat it as if that's in some way an optional extra. The integrity of the single market underpins the European economy because it provides a level playing field on which people can compete with each other and can work across boundaries. They're not going to give that up for the sake of having a deal with the UK. And they're also not going to give that up in circumstances which puts the UK in the driving seat of how the single market develops. Because once that single market is breached, others will wish to breach it too. So there's a possibility of a deal, but it's a very, very difficult political set of circumstances, and Boris Johnson isn't making it any easier. And because this is part of the internal Tory power struggle. And I'm not trying to be overtly political, but you can't really understand Brexit unless you understand how much this is now an internal Tory power struggle, which really doesn't have much to do with anybody else, but it has to do with the Tory party retaining power or trying to retain power. And the Tory party is the world's most successful political party. They've held government longer than any other political party in the world. Even the Mexican Institutional Revolutionary Party has not been in power for so long, over so many years. So holding on to power is important, and that is an issue. And then you could be really optimistic about this and to say that, frankly, eventually people will wake up to the danger that exists and will say, can we not do the sensible thing. Now, the sensible thing, and I say it unashamedly, is to stay in the EU. This was a wrong policy. It was a wrong policy carried out in the wrong way. There might have been a good way to leave the EU. I don't know, but there might have been. You wouldn't trigger Article 50, which has a 2-year timeline, unless you knew what you were going to do during those 2 years. That's not what's happened. But short of staying in the EU, we have offered repeatedly as a government over the last 2 years a set of compromises. We've said, stay in the single market and the customs union, even if that's only temporarily, till you get things sorted out. Just in the way that Norway is in the single market and the customs union. You don't even have to be in the common fisheries policy. Though the problem with the common fisheries policy is not the policy, it's a lack of implementation of the policy in the way that it should be implemented. That would be the sensible thing to do in terms of compromise. But we've seen no compromise from the UK government at all. Essentially, even the Chequers Agreement is a late attempt at compromise, and none with the devolved administrations, and that's very telling. In Scotland, we voted against. In Northern Ireland, they voted against. In Wales, it was quite marginal, but Wales moved against. They have moved not an inch to satisfy the public in those areas. And they are very resistant to moving to compromise. They think they don't need to move to compromise. And as a result of which, this crisis has deepened, including the crisis within these islands. And let me draw that together before we have questions and discussion. I gave evidence to the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee of the House of Commons in, I think, April, and they've just issued a report based on their inquiry into devolution. And I have to say that they surprised me with the strengths of their criticism of the UK government and its approach to devolution. And the reality is that the UK government does not respect devolution because they don't understand devolution. It's quite comforting somehow to think that there's this huge conspiracy against Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. There may well be people conspiring, but the vast majority of people who are in the UK government simply don't know anything about devolution. They don't know how it works, they don't understand it, and they find it very burdensome. And it's not a great role to have, I have to say. Mark Drakeford, my Welsh counterpart, and I often complain about this to ourselves. It's not a great role to have. He and I have to go to every single meeting and sit whining in the corner. But actually we do so because we have to tell people you don't understand how the system works. For a start, there is no hierarchy of governments in devolution. There's a hierarchy of parliaments in devolution. The UK Parliament regards itself as sovereign. Some of us might think that that was a little bit of a fantasy, but that's what it regards itself as. So devolution is a set of compromises to allow the parliaments to work together in a system where one is sovereign. But there's no hierarchy of governments, because there are things that are devolved completely to the Scottish Parliament, just as there are things that are devolved to Wales. And those are the responsibility of the parliaments and the governments of those countries. But that's not how it's seen, and that's not how the EU Withdrawal Bill was put together, and it's not how a lot of the Brexit legislation has been put together. And because they don't understand it, they also can't operate it. So we've come to this impasse on this all sounds very technical, but the impasse on the Sewell Convention, the legislative consent process. Because we can't, frankly, play in a rigged game. The convention is that the UK government asks the permission of the Scottish Parliament to legislate on our behalf. But that must be meaningful. Because if you say no, you can't be treated as if you actually said yes. But that's what's just happened with the EU Withdrawal Bill. That essentially if we say no, or we say nothing, it's the equivalent of saying yes. There is no means of saying no. Now therefore, we can't operate in that system, and therefore I've said to the UK government, we will not approve of any Brexit legislation that you bring to us, primary legislation, because we can't do a deal that way. And we've said to them, you put a system in where if you ask for our permission, you have to accept the outcome. And if you don't ask, we'll just do it. Because they could do that. They could just say, sorry, we're not asking for this bill because it's too important to us, and therefore you can't have a say. But to pretend that consultation is meaningful, and then to say it doesn't matter what you say, simply isn't acceptable. We will cooperate on secondary legislation, the type of regulation we have to put in place for a no deal and things like that, because we have to. But on things like the current trade bill, on the withdrawal agreement bill, probably on the fisheries bill, certainly on the agriculture bill, we won't approve them because we simply cannot trust the system to represent what the Scottish Parliament says, just as the Welsh can't trust it for themselves, and the Northern Irish, were they in session, wouldn't be able to trust it. So, to bring all this together, and I know that I have now thoroughly depressed all of you, is there any hope in this? Well, let's just look at Argyll and see what we could do. I said last time here, and I regularly say, there are 3 areas that Brexit will touch in every organisation and in every life, to a greater extent, a lesser extent. One is money, second one is people, third one is regulation. Now on money, we have a serious situation. Argyll and Bute has been a net recipient of European funding, not just in agriculture funding and rural funding, which is what people think of, but also in social funding and in regional funding. And there's although agricultural funding is now guaranteed until the end of 2021, possibly 22, there is no guarantee on regional or social funding. In fact, we don't know how they will flow. There is a UK government idea for a shared prosperity fund, but that's all we know. There is an idea, which is probably going to be administered by Westminster. And that's big and important. There's also no access now to the European Investment Bank, where loans for big infrastructure projects were available. Now that's important in this constituency. If we look at some of the things that people want to do, a fixed link to Ling, for example, which is something that the community have wanted to do for the last 25 years. It's obvious for European regional development money, it's obvious for European Investment Bank money, it's simply not available. So there will be a financial impact here which we will feel, and we don't know what will replace it. In terms of regulation, that's going to touch every one of us. I'm always slightly entertained when I say to people, are you going to be affected by Brexit? And they say, no, of course not. And you say, well, let's explore the idea. I noticed there was a survey in one of the English regions recently, somebody was telling me about, where a company had come back and said they wouldn't be affected by Brexit in the slightest. And when they looked at the form, it said the company was about importing French and Belgian chocolates. They thought, this is a bit strange, so they went back to them and said, but how are you going to manage? They said, oh, it's okay. We buy them all from an agent in England. I think, well, hang on, think this through. And actually the same is true in terms of regulation. There is regulation that will touch almost every job and profession. It's just there. We just don't recognize it. Food standards. Anybody serving food in restaurants or shops, anybody manufacturing food, agri-food businesses are big, then those 98% of regulations in the food standards area come from Europe or European derived. And we simply will not have time to put every one of those into Scots law. And similarly, in terms of health and safety, environment, huge corpus of environmental legislation, question of putting in place new agricultural support arrangements, all those things people will be touched by. And they will also be touched by workforce issues. I had a meeting today up at Kilmorey with Cleland Snedden, the Argyll and Bute Chief Executive. I see him about every 3 months or so to talk things through. And they were looking, with some worry now, I have to say, at the profile of the workforce in Argyll and Bute. And beginning to realise that there was a pool of labour that would not be available to them. And that pool of labour did lots of different things. It's certainly involved in agriculture, horticulture, aquaculture. But the Scottish Government's plan to expand the number of hours of early years to 1,040, you need to increase the workforce for that, and we need a pool of labour coming in to do that. Hospitality is an area. But then throughout Scotland, it's an issue. 25% of the workforce in the research institutes of our universities comes from the rest of the EU. And although people are not everybody's leaving and not everybody will leave, though a lot of people are saying we don't like this and particularly don't like to be asked to spend 85 quid on staying here and applying for permission to stay here when we've paid our taxes all our lives, when we've contributed to the economic benefit of the area. But in those circumstances, we're not getting fresh people coming in. Because if you have a choice about what you do, what would you do? Would you come here where you're not sure, even though Scotland's been pretty good, or would you go somewhere else, particularly in terms of casual labour? There's a shortage worldwide of agricultural labour, certainly true in Europe. People can get jobs anywhere. So we've got questions of workforce, which are particularly important, money and regulation. And if you're going to analyse what the impact of Brexit will be upon yourselves, then think of those three areas and say to yourselves, how does that affect what I do and the life that I lead? Some people will be hardly impacted at all. Most people will be substantially impacted, but they won't know it until it actually happens. So the final message of hope, because there is a message of hope in this, I think Scotland's a strong and resilient country. I think we've got a tremendously able and adaptable workforce, and I think we can be pretty determined when we set our mind to it, and we're going to have to apply those things over the next few months. There will be people who say, well, you know, it's good that we're not so reliant on labour from elsewhere, though I don't agree with that. The migration, people who come here contribute enormously to, actually contribute financially as well as in every other way. And there's some people who say, well, this will concentrate people's minds on being more self-reliant and more resilient. Well, you know, there's an argument in that, but it shouldn't happen like that. It certainly shouldn't happen overnight. And it shouldn't happen in a way which is going to be very damaging to our economy in the short, medium, and possibly long term. I think there is a possibility of moving this forward without huge dislocation if it is still possible to influence the UK government on it. But I think, and you know, it will be no surprise to anybody in this room, I also think that the best way to move forward on this is to find the opportunity in which Scotland can make a choice. And whether Scotland chooses to have a British Brexit, or whether it chooses to be an independent member of the EU, that will be its business. Because that is the choice. There is no status quo. Monsieur Barnier made that point to a committee of the Scottish Parliament, and we really need to remember it. We can't go backwards in this. We can decide how we go forwards, which is with a very damaging set of proposals, in my view, on Brexit, or by becoming an independent member of the EU. And that is a distinct possibility. I spoke at a lunch in Brussels some months ago, which was chaired by Monsieur Van Rompuy, who is the former president of the Commission. And it had a number of very senior former Commission officials there, one of whom was a man called Jean-Claude Piry, who had been the Secretary General, legal Secretary General of the Commission. None of them were enormous fans of Scottish independence. Some of them had spoken against Scottish independence in 2014. But each of them said, look, if Scotland decides that that's what it wants, by constitutional means, because that's really important, if it decides that's what it wants, then that's what it will have. John Kerr, the man who wrote Article 50, who's also on the First Minister's Standing Council, described it as the easiest succession in history. He may or may not be right. But the reality is that choice does exist. So if we have to make that choice, I know what choice I will make, because I do believe in the importance of the EU. And I say that unashamedly. I know lots of people criticize it. Lots of people look at the situation with refugees and others. They look at the Catalan situation and say the EU has let people down. But actually, we've had 50 years of peace and prosperity on the continent of Europe, and that cannot be thrown away. I always refer to the experience of my own family, and I heard Martin Schulz, the former president of the European Parliament, do that at an event in Berlin, and it struck a very strong chord. Because those people who have family who were involved in First and Second World Wars know the personal costs that existed. And they also know that something remarkable happened at the end of the Second World War. That the victor nations reached out their hand to the vanquished nation and said, never again. We cannot do this again. We shouldn't do this again. And as a result of that gesture, something quite unique was built. And it had its faults, but it has produced peace and prosperity. When my father was just 18, he volunteered for the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. And he was on the beach in Dunkirk, and he had a bullet through his knee. And he had that wound for the rest of his life. That never happened to me when I was 19, and it never happened to my son when he was 19. And if all of us bear that in mind, this is not about straight bananas. This is not about some mythical fear that jobs are being taken because they aren't. This is about the type of society we envisage. And whether, with all the difficulties, we can work with other people as equals, because that's what makes this so different from the UK as it is now. If we can work with people as equals, then we can forge a better future for ourselves. But we have to decide to do it. And on this occasion, we have to resist the voices of those who say we shouldn't do it, particularly as they have no alternative. But I'm open to question and discussion. Thank you. I think there is a microphone for those that cannot be heard, but I know a lot of people in this room can be heard, but on you go. Well, take this.
Two very simple examples occur to me.
Sorry, Alan.
He wants me to have a microphone.
He does.
Two simple examples which occurred to me as you were speaking. I received my energy from a company owned by a French company, and I guess if there were no arrangements in place which permitted that relationship to carry on, I might have to worry about my gas and electricity. And practically everybody has one of these, which depends on an international infrastructure continuing to operate without barriers and the internet on our computers. So I think these are, things that could have unintended consequences by accident, by foolishness.
The two interesting examples on the mobile telephony issue. The thing that people would notice most of all would be roaming charges. I mean, okay, I spend more time probably than most people, out with this country, but the roaming charges thing has been an enormous benefit to people, and there's no guarantee of it continuing. They would also notice, the lack of involvement in the new Galileo system, the GPS system, when time will become obvious, not now, but it'll become obvious in time. Energy is an interesting one, because I don't think in the early stages, the issue of ownership of companies for elsewhere will be a huge issue. Those companies, big companies can organize themselves, and most are organizing themselves now. The energy issue is particularly crucial in Northern Ireland, where Northern Ireland is very dependent upon the Republic for energy. And indeed, there is a real crisis in energy supply in Northern Ireland. Part of the curiosity of Northern Ireland politics, of course, is some things don't get done. And one thing that hasn't been done is to create the circumstances in which Northern Ireland is more self-sufficient in energy. That is a huge issue. And there's, of course, the European energy market itself, which is very integrated. Now, these are all things which can be taken care of in negotiation over a period of time, but they can't be done overnight. And if you look at the process, this process, those are things that should have been thought of at the start of the Article 50 process and laid down for decision making. And actually they're hovering around in there as part of the mix of one of the many things that has to be done. I mean, a particularly fascinating one some of you will have seen last week is road haulage. There are about 30,000 UK road haulier permits. People travel backwards and forwards here. The actual number that would be available to the UK as a third country would be 1,490 something. Now, I mean, that sounds ridiculous, but that's actually true. Now, that's one of the things even a no-deal deal would have to deal with, because otherwise it would just stop. So they would have to find a way to allow those permits to continue. But it just shows how, it's not surprising, these systems are one system. You're trying to tease apart systems that have a common origin, and it's going to be hard to do. Please, others. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Hello there, Mike. Obviously, the powers that be in the EU would prefer the UK didn't leave, and they certainly don't want a domino effect of other countries trying to bring that scenario about elsewhere. In conversation with friends at the weekend, one of my friends suggested that things might continually be pushed back until actually nothing happens and we don't leave. Is that possible?
It is possible. I mean, I think the UK is very UK-centric. It thinks the world revolves around it. If you actually look at the dialogue that's taking place, in any of the European countries, this is not the biggest issue. Somebody, during the German election, somebody said with astonishment that the leaders' debate had never mentioned Brexit. As if that was outrageous, that the Germans weren't agonizing about Brexit. They're not agonizing about Brexit. They think it's a done deal. Of course, it would be rather, it didn't happen. It's not contagion is the issue very often in terms of other countries leaving. I mean, even Poland, which is, essentially under sanction now from the EU because of what its right-wing government is doing with the judiciary. Even Poland, there's a vast majority who want to stay. They wouldn't get any sort of majority against it. I think the issue really here is if they were, I think they're quite open to delay. I think they would like delay to have a more orderly departure. But I think they fear suggesting that because it will have an equal and opposite effect on people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, who will, redouble their efforts to have a very blunt exit. I think there are circumstances in which the UK would have to say, look, we need to pause this process. One would be another election. I think if the present government fell, and I think that's a distinct possibility in the autumn, I think if there was then a 3, 4, 5, 6 week period for an election, I think the EU would simply say, look, we're just going to stop this, stand back and see what happens, because you can't negotiate during an election. The timetable is ticking. So let's just pause on this. But of course, that would be met with horror. Nigel Farage, who apparently announced the weekend he's back in frontline politics, which is not bad for a man who's lost 7 parliamentary seats. The reality of this situation is they would just say, enough is enough. But what does that get you? I mean, I think one of the great fears in this is that we could find ourselves this time next year in exactly the position we're in now. Possibly with a withdrawal. That was done on a fudge, but actually nothing resolved. So, this time next year, we're saying, what's going to happen with this, what's going to happen with that? That insecurity and uncertainty is really bad, particularly for companies. And people find it difficult to live with insecurity. So that would be as much of a worry. But anything could happen.
Thank you.
Here, and can we have a microphone over here? Alice has got one.
Thank you. Do you think if Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland were, in some marvellous way, to unite, this would precipitate independence for Scotland? It would take the attention off us and it would provide a precedent.
I think there are lots of things that could happen. I think the interesting thing about Irish reunification is that that's gone back on the agenda in a big way. And when you've got a figure like Peter Robinson saying you would have to be prepared for it, not that he wants it, but you'd have to be prepared for it, that shows how things have changed. I don't know what, I mean, I'm absolutely unsure as to what the triggers would be for Scottish independence. I've always been unsure of those. I think you just have to keep moving forward and say, let's present an argument that works. Perhaps the worst argument is to say there's a really bad thing happening next door, we'd better get away from it. But maybe it does allow people to concentrate on what the reality is. I mean, 2014, I remember very well, people arguing that you couldn't be in the EU, if you're an independent country. Now we now know that the opposite of that was true. So people are looking at that. But independence as an argument needs to stand on its own 2 feet. And it probably can't be won by reference to elsewhere. But anything could happen in Ireland. I mean, I am astonished at the way in which reunification has become an issue, which I never thought would be an issue, certainly in my lifetime, given the entrenched nature of the Irish situation. Of course, the opposite is true. You can fall into a situation in Ireland in which you see the re-emergence of violence and dissension. I spend quite a lot of time in Ireland, and it is, in my view, a very fragile situation, and we shouldn't take advantage of it. We shouldn't make comparisons. We should just be worried that there's a very big deterioration taking place. Sectarianism and actions within communities is back. Gangsterism is back. And both the PSNI and the Garda are saying you could not have a border because it wouldn't last 10 minutes. So we've got some real problems in there. But what the sequence is, gosh, I don't know. It could be any sequence. Other people. Please. Margaret, Alice is going to give you a microphone.
Hi. I have a son who's a UK citizen and a daughter-in-law who's a German citizen. And I'm wondering how Brexit will affect them.
Where do they live?
Fulda in Germany.
They shouldn't be affected because they both will have rights of residence. Her problem would be if they move back here, then she would have to have 5 years residence in order to qualify for settled status. Now, as married to a UK citizen, that would put her in a position where she could reside, but she would still have to get settled status on her own account. So that would be an issue. Similarly, in Germany, the same sort of thing would apply. I think this type of thing will be resolved pretty easily on the grounds that we don't want people to be deported one place to another. Certainly in Germany, it'll be quite easy. I'm not sure sometimes in this country I wonder how easy it will become. I see a lot of EU citizens here who are very worried about how they've been treated. And I think that's a bigger concern than what would happen in Germany itself. Mm-hmm. But she should certainly, if she's going to live here, apply for settled status so that she has that. And of course, anybody who's been here for 5 years is entitled to that. Anybody who's been here less than 5 years is entitled to stay until they get it. And that applies to anybody who comes here or stays here before the date of departure. Well, actually, before the end of transition, which is if it happens with the end of 2020. So that is a reasonable set of guarantees. The UK government also says that they will apply that, presently say they will apply that even if there is no deal. But of course, if there is no deal, there will be no mechanism to police it. And that's, as I said earlier about trust, an important issue. It's not just happening, it's a fact that the withdrawal deal dealing with EU citizens has within it a mechanism whereby they can enforce their rights, which is a very European thing, which we've tended not to think about too much. You have rights, and you should be entitled to enforce them. And that's very much the basis, for example, of European jurisprudence. And we need to have that here. Sometimes it's hard to do. With an unwritten constitution, it's hard to do. Yeah.
I have an online question from Ken MacDonald, who says sterling has fallen considerably against other currencies when the no vote was announced, and currently we're still in the EU. What do you expect to happen on the 29th of March next year as regards currency? Oh gosh,
I am not exactly. I don't want to be responsible for people going out and speculating tonight. Okay, I have no idea. I mean, the fall in sterling, of course, has been beneficial for exporters. They have found that useful. It's been pretty bad for importers, and it's been pretty bad for tourists. I actually saw something today I was involved in which people were getting parity euros for pounds, which is where we are. I have no idea where it will be, but this is, in general, in my view, not good for our economy, and that's the issue. The way in which the value that any currency has is a product of the view of the international community about the economic prospects of that country and how that country is managing itself economically. This is not a good set of circumstances, in my view, for anybody that's predicting the economy and how it will do. The Scottish Government's figures, which are very similar to the UK Government's figures, we published ours. If you remember, the UK Government hid theirs until they were forced to publish them. They're broadly the same, and they show that there will be a difficulty over a substantial period of time. So that would reflect upon all the international indicators. But I'm certainly not going to predict currency movements. Certainly, that's way outside my pay grade, or ability, I have to say. Okay, good. Other questions? Please. Sorry, and Alistair's got his microphone.
Just try not to forget the question in that. So, in all of this, how does the Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament avoid taking the blame for things that come through Brexit once it's done?
Well, I think there's two sets of blame that are floating around. One is Brexiteers blaming people for the difficulties and problems that exist. See that quite often. I noticed a civil servant I know tweeting the other night about the way that civil servants were being attacked. And scapegoats are being sought. And, undoubtedly the Scottish Government's principled stance on this will be something that some Brexiteers will wish to blame for whatever takes place. In terms of the consequences of Brexit, it's really important that we make it clear, as we do make it clear. First of all, as a nation, we didn't vote for this. But secondly, that to be realistic, we cannot mitigate against all the harm of this. And it's really important we tell people that, and that we would rather stay in the EU. Now, these are all messages it's quite difficult to put over in a single sentence, but we need to stress those things. I mean, the Scottish Government has tried, certainly over the last period it's been in office in the last 10 or 11 years, to mitigate on occasions where there's been damage being done by the UK government. The bedroom tax is an obvious example. But there's some things you can't mitigate. We couldn't mitigate, in certain circumstances for some of the things that will come out of this. The ending of access to the European Investment Bank. We can't mitigate that. We don't have the resource to do that. So in all those circumstances, we have to explain to people that cannot be done. I hope people accept we are as good as our word on that. You know, there are things that we can't do, but what we can do, we will do, and that's also part of the problem. You know, we are constantly looking at what is happening and saying, what can we do to assist these circumstances? And that will be true later this week when we see the text of the 70 or so notices. You know, we will have to say, look, you know, we'll do everything we can, but some things are out with our gift. Okay. Questions? Max.
Is it on? Yes, it is on. Given what's happened over the Brexit and the way things have gone, there's not only a threat, there's a threat to devolution as well in the way that things have gone. And whether or not independence can be secured, it seems to me it's important to keep devolution. And within the 7 years that they've got, we should see the end of it. And both the UK parties, to my mind, are not really interested. And if they want to do something, they just go ahead and do it.
I think you're right. In the first thing we published on this in December 2016, Scotland's Place in Europe, we argued for an extension of devolution because we felt there were certain things which we were challenged by with Brexit that we needed additional powers to do. We still believe that that is the case. You know, there are things, trade is a good example. Next week I'm going to publish a paper, a Scottish Government paper on trade. But I gave a lecture on it in Dublin about 6 weeks ago. Trade is reserved. Trade negotiations are reserved. But the implications of trade negotiations will be felt on devolved areas of competence. You know, the mythical, well, not the mythical, but the fabled chlorinated chicken, you know, will have an impact on food standards and will have an impact on agriculture. So we need to be engaged in that process of trade in a way that is meaningful. So that's an extension of the devolved powers. Now, I do agree, however, that the devolved powers are under threat. We've seen that with the power grab that we've had. I think that there are, as I indicated, people who know nothing about devolution. I think there are also those who are hostile to devolution. I would be surprised to find that Boris Johnson was a friend of the Scottish Parliament. In fact, I'd be gobsmacked to discover he was a friend of the Scottish Parliament. And when we talk about scapegoating, I think there is a possibility that the scapegoat will be, well, you know, we need unity in these circumstances, so devolved administrations are an irrelevance to that. Now, I think the people of Scotland would not accept that. I think that's a clear set of circumstances we have to argue. But I also think that the best way, you know, in the end, to protect the constitutional settlement is to take it to its logical conclusion. Because if you take it to the logical conclusion, nobody can do that. They can't interfere in it. So if you believe that devolution is the right thing and you think devolution has worked, then one of the arguments you might want to consider is if we can do that well in some things, should we do it well in all the things that we're engaged in? And should we have the opportunity to do so? Trade, international relations are areas. There's clearly an attempt to hem us in too. If you watch the, and I'm sad enough to have watched most of it, but if you watch the Supreme Court case some weeks ago, you know, the Advocate General, Lord Keane, was keen to argue an interpretation of the international relations reservation that was all-embracing. That essentially the Scottish Parliament could do nothing and say nothing about international relations because it was all reserved. Now, that is, in my view, a ludicrous argument because we have a power to deal with EU legislation. And therefore, there is a role for the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government in international relations because we have an obligation to take EU directives and other things and put them into Scots law. But, you know, that's the type of erosion that's taking place all the time. So, expand the powers and take them to their logical conclusion is, I think, the best way to do so. We're trying to do so.
Can you just repeal the Act of Union then?
I'm always very cautious about people who say, you know, about once every 6 weeks somebody writes to me or emails or tweets or puts in Facebook a miracle way of repealing the Act of Union. There is some extraordinary thing. You know, there's something written in invisible ink on page 26 or something. I just don't think life's like that. I just don't think it's going to work like that. If you're going to do this, you've got to do it in the honest, straightforward way. So, yeah, Blackie. Which makes it more important that we do, in my view. I think you have to be... I remember, Alex Salmond always used to observe, and he's absolutely right to have observed it, and he's still right with this, that seeking, you know, constitutional change and independence is very important. but the way you do it is as important as what you do. And you have to do it. You can't do it by stealth. It's impossible to do it by stealth. You have to do it by seeking the active, sincere, full-hearted involvement of people who are going to choose it. And, you know, with all its difficulties, I still think that's the right way to do it. Lackey, sorry. It's a microphone.
It's a microphone. I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but how much do you think?
Surely don't.
No, I don't believe in all that sort of nonsense. But well, he does. But how much do you think it suits the British government the fact that the Assembly in Stormont isn't sitting? Do you think that is an issue? And do you think maybe the DUP's $1 billion has got anything to do with it, or is that just me being sitting beside Alistair?
Yeah, it's rubbing off on you, Lackey. Be careful. I think there are advantages and disadvantages to the UK government in that situation. But I think if there are sensible heads, they will realise that the disadvantages are much bigger than the advantages. You know, I mean, it's a disadvantage to the Scottish government because, in a very simple way, one example is a joint ministerial committee. I sit there with my Welsh counterpart. We are immensely strengthened if there are two Northern Irish people there, because always two, one Sinn Féin and one DUP. And I've worked with the DUP before, and we don't agree on a lot of things, but there are occasions in which they will weigh in defence, for example, of agriculture in Northern Ireland or whatever. The balance is missing. So I don't think that that's a conspiracy, but I do think that the influence of the DUP is a negative thing. I think that accepting the support of the DUP to stay in power, clearly substantial sums of money have been involved in that, though it's not been paid, of course, because there's no administration to hand it over. I think in those circumstances, they did something that made it inevitable that they couldn't get a deal because it created circumstances in which the influence of the DUP was too great. The DUP is also two parties, by and large. You've got the Northern Irish Assembly DUP and you've got the Westminster DUP, and the Westminster DUP is more extreme and less likely, I think, to be constructive. So I think you've got all those circumstances. I do think that we need an Assembly in Northern Ireland. We need all the parties. I don't think the DUP will be part of this, but I think most of the others in Northern Ireland, perhaps not all, but most of them would be part of it, working with the parties in Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales on a common approach. Now, you know, we even had the Tories in that in Scotland over the Withdrawal Bill for a period of time. We managed to refuse legislative consent with a majority of 90, I think it was 93 to 30, 92 to 30, I can't precisely remember. So we had all the parties except the Tories on that. I think this is one of those circumstances where we try to get as many people as possible in the room. And I have, when I'm in Northern Ireland, I will speak to all the parties. I try to speak to the DUP, it doesn't always happen, but we need to try and keep those channels open. I think there are other things that you might look for conspiracies in, and I think one of the most interesting that I've referred to, apart from we haven't touched at all upon the very doubtful practices of those who've argued for leave and how they ran their campaign. But I do think that the UK government's attempt to frighten the extreme leavers by the consequences of a no deal has backfired spectacularly. I think that started off as a means to corral them into coming along with the Chequers Agreement, and has ended up as beginning to look like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think that was very foolish. Yeah.
Time from the gallery. Can you give an insight into the ideology followed by Brexit ministers who believe that they can make a real success of trade outside the EU? What is their economic vision?
Oh, I know I can't. I mean, if I were to, I think it's something like, trying to go into somebody's mind like that would not be good for me. There are people who believe in this at any cost. It is something that is worth doing at any cost. But there are also people who've just inhaled it and just believe it with every fibre of their being and don't look at the reality of the situation. And there are ministers who do believe that there is some miraculous set of trade arrangements that we haven't come to, despite the evidence. And the evidence is overwhelming. Germany is the most successful international exporting and business country, not just in Europe, but one of the most successful in the world. It is in the EU. They are not going to leave the EU. The only country in the world that is not a member of or associated with a trading bloc is Mauritania. You know, and the French ambassador to Washington very memorably said some months ago that, you know, to believe that you further the cause of free trade by leaving the world's biggest free trade bloc and 50 free trade arrangements is, to say the least, questionable. But you have people, you know, for whom this is an idée fixée. They have believed in this all their political life. They now see an opportunity to do it, and they say it without evidence. It is going to be pretty tragic because it cannot be done. There is not. It's just not possible to do that. You also don't have people who have the experience of negotiating trade deals. Trade deals have been negotiated for the last 50 years almost by the EU. You don't have that expertise, and it's a very, very difficult thing to do. You know, and it just shows in how they discuss things like the WTO. I mean, I've only visited once, but I spent part of a day last year at the WTO in Geneva, and this is not the home of free trade. This is a very much a rules-based organization which endeavors to regulate what takes place. It is not a place where you bring in and say, I'm going to have a deal with you tomorrow and this is going to work wonderfully well. It's not what it's about. But I can't get into their minds, nor do I wish to get into their minds. I just think that we need to have a very calm approach to this and say, we do not believe they're telling the truth. Please. Yes. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, Michael, near the end of your talk, you said that Scotland will have a choice. It's a British Brexit or as an independent EU member state. Surely there's more than that. Surely there are other choices. I came along to Leslie Riddoch's talk in here, and she explained that there should be more choices if there's another. You know, it's not necessarily Scotland going straight back into the European Union. So surely there'll be more.
Yes,
more choices than just that.
Well, you could choose not to be in the EU or in EFTA, but to have a Skexit, right? And to be out of the EU. I just don't see what that would get us. And you know, we've had this conversation before. I believe membership of the EU is the right thing to do. EFTA is an interesting one because it's a compromise. EFTA was designed, the EFTA EEA membership, European Economic Area membership, was designed for countries that wanted to come into the EU. Now, some like Norway, Liechtenstein, haven't done so, Iceland. They've stayed within that arrangement. And it's a good enough arrangement for them. But it's not as good as full membership. You know, and you don't, for example, get to take part in decision making. There's a consultation mechanism. So if you're going to be in that, for me, that's a compromise at the moment. It's a compromise for where we find ourselves. And it's a compromise I would accept as being better than Brexit. But I don't, personally, and you know, and that's the government's position, but there could be another position. The government's position is being a full member of the EU serves our purpose and the purpose of small nations particularly well. Let me give you a concrete example, which is this much maligned freedom of movement, right? Freedom of movement isn't actually totally free. You really have to have a job in most of the definitions that exist, and you can't stay forever if you don't have a job. But freedom of movement allows us, as a small country that isn't reproducing ourselves, to be able to continue to operate economically, and particularly here. All the local authority areas on the west coast of Scotland are losing population. Right? Now, you could say we'll breed more effectively, but that's not going to give us working age population for another 20 years or so, right? So that's a period of time in which we're not going to be able to do that. We're also aging, so there are some limitations upon us being able to do so. So how are you going to be able to operate as we do at present without migration? Now, Brexiteers, I mean, I've heard Michael Gove and I have debated this point actually. Gove says the European system is unfair because it favours European nationals and it discriminates against non-European nationals. So we need a fair system. But you know, and he often talks about prejudice against the Bangladeshi builder in favour of the Polish plumber. But actually what he wants is neither. They don't want migration. We need migration. Now, I could argue all sorts of cases, and I don't think you would agree in terms of the cultural and social benefits of migration, but economically, we need migration. So being within the EU and observing the 4 freedoms fully is advantageous to us, and we should do so. Now, Switzerland has this odd relationship that's treaty-based, and it's tried to resist freedom of movement, but it's largely failed to do so. So in these circumstances, I think for a small country, with some considerable advantages in terms of assets, but some considerable needs, particularly in terms of workforce, it's the best deal for us. Now, of course, that will be a matter for political contention. I think, given the result of the referendum and the recent polling, most people agree with that, but there will be people who don't. And the latest poll on this stuff tended to indicate that there were about, I think there was 19% of people who thought that the SNP was too pro-EU, SNP voters, right? And I accept that there will be that. That's a difficulty. I'm just trying to persuade people that I'm not too pro-EU. I just think it's worked for us. And I think the evidence says that that will be the right thing for us. And that's what I would argue. Yeah. Microphone? Sorry.
So, firstly, a little comment from my youth, which is, I think Michael Gove forgets our Fidesain pet, which came from a situation where I think people went the other way.
Yeah,
if I remember rightly.
Still do.
Yeah.
Lots and lots of people go to work in.
Yeah. That was for sort of the same reasons that people are coming this way. Mm-hmm. But I wonder if there are 2 things here. One is EFTA again. I'll raise that one because does that make it easier or more difficult or make no difference if the UK is out of Europe and has some no deal or crazy deal? Does it make it easier for us to find some middle ground? And do you feel that we might need the sort of arrangement that Finland has in terms of joining the EU as a full member to give it some sort of protection against the rather bullying next door neighbour that was bigger? Would we feel that do you feel we might find ourselves in that circumstance? I'm not mentioning any next door neighbour in either case, quite deliberately.
Well, I think there are security reasons why we should be, part of the EU. But I'm one of these people who's argued for a very long time in this party, as some people know, that NATO membership is important for Scotland. That's not always been a popular position in the SNP, but I think just your size means that you have to recognize size and geography. You have to recognise our geopolitical issues. We are on the Icelandic Gap. That's a big issue. And we're also a small country, and therefore we need a defence association of some sort. So those issues are in there. In terms of EFTA membership, I don't think it's any easier than anything else. I think if we find ourselves out after next March, which must at least be a reasonable prospect, and we were to choose independence, how would we get back in? Well, the process would be accession. We're sort of going through an accession in reverse at the moment. I had a fascinating conversation with a group of European Court of Justice judges some months ago, and the very nice woman from Cyprus, who had been involved in their negotiations for accession, suddenly a light bulb went off her head and said, but really what you're doing is you're just doing accession in reverse. And that's what we're doing. So to some extent we'd be prepared for that. As I've indicated, some people think it would be a reasonably easy accession. Whether joining EFTA and EEA and working our way in that gradually would be a better way, I think would be discussion at the time. I think EFTA would be quite pleased. EFTA has difficulty, I think, envisaging the UK as a member, though I think that would be possible. But Scotland fits the profile of an EFTA member very, very effectively. So I think they'd be quite pleased. That would be a decision for us to make. My own view is that we should seek to re-enter and do that as a full member and show willing that we want to do that. If we follow that route, I think there will be a lot of support for us in Europe. Not unanimous. We've got the question of Spain always raises its head, but I think there's a lot of support for us. And one of the things that, as a government, we've been very engaged in, and I'm very conscious of this, and I do it a lot, particularly when I'm in the European Parliament, is actually say to people, hang on, you've got a nation of 5 million people here, 62% of whom voted, of those who voted, not to leave. You have an obligation to those citizens? I often hear from people who say, I don't want to lose my European passport. And that is an issue for people. And therefore, I think it's something, it's not a card at the present moment that they look at very strongly, but it might be a strong card to play in accession. You know, we also have observed the acquis. You know, we've had over 40 years of observing the acquis. We are essentially, we observe all the things that are required in those circumstances in terms of rule of law, procedures. So I just think that's the right thing for us to do. But it's a debate. It's a discussion. And maybe people have different views. But the Scottish Government's view at the moment is membership of the EU would be the right thing to do. And EEA and EFTA, EEA countries are not in the Common Agricultural Policy or the Common Fisheries Policy. But again, that would be a discussion to be had. Reforming the Common Fisheries Policy along the lines of what it actually is about might be a very important thing to do. Conscious of time, perhaps a couple more from people who, Alistair, there, and anybody else still wants to ask a question. Alistair, and then one more.
Thanks, Mick. I'd kind of like to try and bring it local and localise this a little bit. I have a great fear that when Brexit happens, the economy is going to crash, the pound is going to lose its value, and the cost of food is definitely going to increase. And right now, the second stage on the Community Empowerment Act within allotments is taking place.
Right.
And it will soon be there that what the local authorities have to do and what they can and can't do in implementation. And I'm just wondering if the Scottish Government could work with the administrations and local authorities to make land easy, including government offices, to make land available for people to grow food. That's part one, and if that's at all possible. The second aspect is, well, another one of my favourite subjects is industrial hemp, and that the government works again with the local authority administrations to create the protocols necessary for farmers to quickly enable themselves to make use of this product, because it is going to become available within pretty quickly. So I'm just wondering.
Okay. Let me deal with the second one, because you've already steered that one successfully through the party conference. I mean, I am not involved in the slightest, but as your local MSP, that is the party's view that we should be doing it. And I'm sure you and others will pressure the party in government to do so. On the first one, I don't want to, I don't want us to get to the position that we're saying to people, you better go out and grow more courgettes, because otherwise you're going to starve. But I do think that we need to say, and this is out with Brexit, Alistair, you know my view is, as a former Environment Minister, I want to see more allotments. I want to see land that's owned by government and government agencies made available for community use, including local authority land. You know, that the record of this local authority and community asset transfer is not yet very good, and I encourage the local authority to do more. And as you know, wearing my local MSP hat, I'll do everything I can to encourage that. I think it's the right thing to happen, and I hope it will happen. I want it to happen. You know, the Environment Minister is the largest landowner in Scotland. You know, I had that dubious distinction for 2.5 years, followed by an even more unlikely candidate to be the largest landowner in Scotland, Rosanna Cunningham. I say that as a friend of hers, just in case this recording offends her in any sense. You know, so, but the government has a lot of land, and it should be possible for some of that land to be accessed. Local authorities have lots of land too. I'd like to see it put to more productive use in small quantities, and people with the opportunity to have allotments and grow vegetables, I'd be enthusiastic about. How could I not be, you know? Any final question? Alec, I'll take Alec, and I'll take one over there. So take Alec and then one there, okay? Fine. Can we have your microphone?
Thanks, Michael. Last question here. I'm just wondering, looking at the polls there for independence at the moment, why do you think they haven't shifted at the moment? Do you think it's because Scotland hasn't really felt any real collateral damage from Brexit yet, and that's still to happen, and then we'll start to see the polls shifting above 50%? I know we have our support for independence has increased in almost every poll that I've noticed. It's sort of sitting around between 50 and 45, and these sorts of figures. But we'll have to see the collateral from Brexit before they really shift. Because people seem to be listening to an awful lot of rhetoric on both sides of the Brexit debate, and they're maybe sick of it, and maybe the only way they're going to actually understand you know, that Scotland isn't well served within the Union of the United Kingdom. Maybe the only way they're going to understand that is having less money in their pocket, losing their job, etc. No one wants to see that happen, but I suspect that is precisely what is going to happen in time.
I think people are more aware of what is happening now than they were even a month or 6 weeks ago. You know, anecdotally, and you can only go by people who talk to you, more people talk to me than ever before. More people talk to my ministerial team than ever before. We had a strategy session last week, and I think it was clear from that. People are waking up to this. The no deal stuff has energized and galvanized people quite a lot, because I think they thought up until then this was all a political debate. But actually, I disagree that the polls haven't shifted. I think some interesting things have happened if you go into the polls in detail. It's not the same 47% that might have been 2 or 3 years ago. A substantial element is, you know, but some people have gone into the don't know or doubtful camp who were profoundly in favour of Brexit, who were independent supporters. In other words, they were yes voters in 2014, they were leave voters in 2016, and I think they started off thinking that leaving was more important than yes. That may change. Other people who were no voters in 2014 have become persuaded that independence is the way in order to continue. I mean, inevitably, I would meet lots of those people because they're more likely to talk to me. So I think there's been a shift in the makeup of the 45, 46, 47, looks roughly where it is, right? And that's maybe what we're seeing. For example, there's quite a lot of EU citizens, you know, who would have voted no in 2014, who would now be interested in voting yes because they recognise that something has changed. So my view is this is very fluid. I think there are lots of grounds for the SNP to be pleased, if not complacent, about what is taking place. You know, we've been in government for 11 years, and we're about 12 to 15 to 18 points ahead in political polls. There is still very strong support for independence. You know, when I was cutting my teeth in politics, you know, and people would remember that, Dave Hill would remember that. You know, if you were to see a poll for independence that had 12%, you know, you would think heaven had arrived, you know. So this has changed, but this is has been a long game, and we won't see the outcome of it for a while yet. But I think it will move, and people will have a choice to make, and I think we should be very honest about that. And the choice is no longer, in 2014, the choice was essentially a leap in the dark, or stay as you are. Now the choice would be Brexit and all it means, or actually being able to do something which I think we understand. You know, membership of the EU has its meaning, and people understand it. So I think this is a different set of choices which we'll look at. Please.
You mentioned earlier the possibility of a general election in the autumn. Mike Fennick has obviously picked up on that online, and I'm wondering if you see further bust-ups and divisions within the Tory party that might bring that about, and even if it doesn't, you know, between now and March next year, can you see what might well happen within the Tory party?
Oh gosh, the things I'm asked to predict. Yeah, I think a general election is as likely as anything else. I think it's probably more likely than a second vote. I think the mechanism by which it could come about would be many and varied, but one would be, you know, a Tory leadership challenge, a change of Prime Minister, but a Prime Minister unable to command a majority in the House of Commons, in which case he then... But it's impossible to say. All of us might have said 12 months ago, Theresa May can't last another week. You know, there she is. So I think we're almost out of predictions, except to say, I would have thought the political instability will be such that it would be difficult to go perhaps beyond the autumn or into next year without another election, but they might do. I mean, the weakness of the Labour opposition is a factor in there. The fact that if there was an election, the Tories might win it. There's been an increase in support for UKIP in the last month, up about 5%. The Tories down about 5%. That creates circumstances in which the Tories might want to avoid an election because they would find their heels being nipped in constituencies where that might make all the difference. So Labour might win that election. Its poll position in Scotland is less good than it was last year. In England it's less good, but it might just find a way through. It's impossible to say. And you know, in those circumstances, I suppose this rounds things off. In those circumstances, our obligation in Scotland really is to look at the situation and say, what is best for Scotland, for our fellow citizens, not in a partisan way, but to say what's best for our fellow citizens. If we can't and aren't staying in the EU in the immediate future, though I still hope that might happen, then the best thing is to stay in the single market and the customs union. Over the last 2 years, since we put that forward as a view, suggested either for the whole of the UK or just for Scotland, differentiated, the argument has moved towards us. So we need to keep articulating that, keep arguing it, and keep the argument moving towards us. What the outcome will be, I don't know, but we have to make sure that we're honest to what we believe, and we do believe in a more open, more connected society than we appear to be promised from elsewhere. But anyway, thank you for coming on a night like this, and no doubt we'll have a chance to talk about it again. Thank you.